For the next hour, we'll be focusing on the tactical level of the approach, the systems approach that we're all taking together. And we're going to hear again from Scott, who will be representing work of the team relative to the protocol investment game that you'll hear more of. And then we'll hear from our colleague, Glenn Tonzer, and I'll introduce Glenn when we're ready to hear from him. So, Scott et al.
I'm probably not going to give Chris a real chance to introduce these two because we're kind of tag teaming just like Luke and I did. Eric is a postdoc at the University of Vermont in the Social Ecological Gaming and Simulation Lab. He was the first successful Ph.D. defense in our new complex systems department. So he's a recent doctor and the first in a long line, I imagine, in our complex systems. Ollin is a graduate student in computer sciences, complex systems. In complex systems, he is a computer scientist that does a lot with big data and machine learning, and brings a lot of skills to the table. He's relatively new to our team, came in within the last year or so, and is from Mexico. Mexico City? Yeah. Mexico City. So he brings a lot of skills to the table, and he's going to be talking to us a lot about the learning aspect of what actually happens during the process of playing these games and the strategy development. We are now going to talk a little about a different game. This is the game at the tactical level, and this is our looking at willingness to invest and spend some money on biosecurity when we provide different amounts of information and different kinds of information. This is work obviously supported by the same project, and we're trying to protect herd health. So, as I mentioned, we've got our pyramid here of different ways of looking at this system. We discussed earlier this operational compliance game. We're going to move on to the tactical level, where people are acting as owners and operators of a specific facility, and they're looking at investing money in biosecurity to try to protect their facility. And in this situation, to give you a brief highlight, my numbers seem to be missing here, but we have a change here in a value on people's willingness to actually invest, again with different information but the same risk levels. We have a change here from about 57% to 37% about. And it's a pretty big willingness to change based on information in this system. There's a big jump that we're seeing by just providing information and providing tweaks to that information. Additionally, we're seeing some really big differences when we tweak that information. These individual differences. Some people are reacting one way and some people are acting in the exact opposite way, which really opens the door, unfortunately, for some of these perverse incentives where you potentially have a policy that you want to enact, and this may work for a lot of the public, but say 20% of the public or the operators go in an opposite direction. And if that 20% is important and going in the wrong direction, you may have to re-examine that policy. So these individual differences are really interesting. We're also going to show you how we're able to cluster these groups of behaviors into people that are risk averse. And then there's a group of people that are tolerant of risk. They're taking a fair amount of chances here. And then there's a group here that we're calling the opportunists. And those people really seem to use the information that we provide to them And I think that's going to provide, that's going to be discussed by Eric a lot, some really good opportunities to provide messages to people and different information to them, because they're responding really well. The other people are not responding as much to our messages. And Ollin is going to talk about some of these learning behaviors that we're actually seeing in the data that's gathered. How do people change their strategies during this process as they learn about this and develop these things? So we can use some of this information to see how, in a simulated system that maybe Gabriella and Eric will talk about later, how we can use this information on learning and development to actually expand into a more simulated, realistic system-wide approach. Again, the game we're talking about here is, we're calling it the protocol adoption or protocol investment game. In this game, we're looking at the value of information. We have a number of facilities on the board, and they can decide whether or not they want to increase their level of biosecurity. Again, we're using performance-based incentives. So if they increase their biosecurity, they are taking cash out of their pocket to paying for it. So it is actually cash in hand. And we're using that information from here to improve our agent-based model. This is the agent-based model of North Carolina. So we're using some of those data actually in that model. So the background of this game. We have one contaminated facility to start, and you have a facility that is your facility here, that's your site, and you have a bunch of information provided to you. You have, it's kind of hard to tell here, but there's 2 pieces of information for every site. One is a box that tells you about the biosecurity level, and one is a circle that tells you about whether or not the facility has a disease there, it's an infected or contaminated facility, or not. So the red is a infected or contaminated facility. Now, we vary the information that we provide to those people and have them run many of these different rounds. So I guess this would have been a better slide to actually explain a lot of that. So you can see the little boxes there and the circles. So these are the treatments that we actually had them run through, at least in one of the games. So here we don't provide them any information about where the disease is in the system or what people are doing to protect themselves from or in a biosecurity sense. So everything is grayed out. There is no information there. If we're looking at the disease spectrum, we go from some information about disease to they have all the information about disease in the system, where it is, and how much disease is in the system. This is played over multiple months, so the disease actually spreads over a course of multiple months. Here on this axis, we see them changing from no information about what people are doing to protect their facilities to having full information about what people are doing to protect their facilities. We know everything about their biosecurity. And the 9 treatments here go from full information about both to no information about both. So in the biosecurity protocols, so when we have no information about what people are actually doing to protect their facilities, that's when we actually see the most investment in with biosecurity. They put the most money in, they'll take the most money out of their own personal pockets to put into biosecurity to protect themselves. So in this sense, the uncertainty in the situation, not knowing what's going on, actually provides the biggest bang for your buck. Not communicating, which is surprising, not communicating what other people are doing in the system actually is helpful. which goes against a lot of the things that we're actually thinking about. You know, when we're thinking we need to increase communication. If we increase communication, then we'll have better response. But when we actually tell people about what everybody is doing, we actually see some people like, well, you know, what's called the free rider effect. I don't need to because everybody else around me is actually protecting me. The system's pretty well in place, and you know, all these other people are protecting me, so I don't have to worry about it. Unfortunately, that does seem to reflect a lot of situations in real life. We also, surprisingly, even when the biosecurity was really bad all around them, we still saw this. So even the free rider effect, you know, you'd think, okay, well, they're only going to do that when everybody's doing a really good job protecting. We still saw this same pattern when the people were actually doing when the biosecurity that they saw around them was actually really bad biosecurity. Their people around them weren't doing much. We still saw that pattern. Really interesting. It's not all that free rider. When we talk about disease, we saw a completely different pattern. When we actually showed people where the disease was with this full kind of information, that's when we saw the most investment in biosecurity. Now, these situations are the same. There's the same spread of the disease, but when people didn't know where it was, they're like, it'll be fine. Very surprising to me that they weren't willing, or they invested the least when they didn't know what was going on. So this uncertainty in one situation really seemed to help. In a different situation, it was the exact opposite. So that component of trying to understand that is a really interesting component. So as you can see here, we have these different patterns there with that same kind of switch in that uncertainty. Really interesting there. So what we can do with that is we can see, okay, what are the people actually individually doing? So when we have them play all these different scenarios, we have some people that are, you know, generally a high risk. They're not putting very much investment into biosecurity. There's other people that are generally low risk, and they're putting a lot of biosecurity and they're investing a lot to keep themselves safe under almost every circumstance. And then there's a bunch of people in the middle. When we didn't tell people about where the disease was, we had a lot of people in this kind of high-risk situation. So if it was all grayed out, there was no information about disease, we had a lot of people doing this high-risk behavior. When we shifted to telling people about where the disease was in the system, we shifted a lot of that behavior to this low risk. They started really investing. The interesting thing here with this shift is that it wasn't consistent on this behavior. And this is what I mentioned earlier. So we did see a lot of people that really increased. There's a 6% increase to a 17% increase here, even a 1/3 increase in their investment. So there's a big chunk here that really increased their investment. But you see the people down here with the same switch. There was a lot of people that decreased their investment. And that we had about 20% went the opposite way that we actually thought they would. So I'm going to switch over to some of the big data approaches that Eric will have a chance to talk about here.
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everybody. So my research focuses on identifying potential behavioral distributions from all the decisions from our sampled participants. So what we used was this well-established online survey marketplace, Amazon Mechanical Turk, to rapidly recruit 1,000 participants to play our digital field experiment. Here's hopefully not an example of one of these Mechanical Turkers. Dog hook up to a little fun machine. I've actually worked with this tool in the past and have had problems where our research was gamified and we had to go through and clean some of the data. So for these experiments, we actually built some protocols in to weed out these potential dubious behaviors and bots. So we also use these performance-based incentives that Scott mentioned in order to bolster the realism of people's decision-making process. That is, their end-game score directly translated into monetary payment. So our goal was to quantify the distributions across this risk aversion scale. So how many people are playing in this risk-averse way where they increase their biosecurity, they invest in these biosecurity protocols more often to reduce their chances of contagion. Then we have, on the other end of the spectrum, these risk acceptors or risk-tolerant group who tend to implement very little biosecurity to gamble for that higher payout. And we calculated an individualized risk score using each of their biosecurity investment decisions per round. So what we did was we split each of their decisions into a two-dimensional spectrum. We looked at all of their decisions based upon a low contagion rate, which was communicated to the player via the interface, as well as a high contagion rate along the y-axis here. So what we found was, using k-means clustering, three prominent behaviors seemed to pop out. Each of these dots is one of the 1,000 participants' gameplay data, quantified into these risk aversion metrics. So one way to look at this is, at the point 0, 0, this player never implemented biosecurity throughout the entire game. Not great. Whereas these people up here, we're calling these the risk averse, tend to implement quite a bit of biosecurity investment earliest into the game to reduce their chances of infection. But what was really interesting was this third group, which we're calling the opportunists, because they really adapted to the information provided. They mitigated their risk, but they also worked to gamble for that higher payout. And we can see this via some histograms of each of their gameplay behaviors. On this top row, we have decisions based upon this low contagion rate, and the bottom row are the higher contagion rates. And on the x-axis, each decision year consisted of 6 months where they can decide whether or not to increase their biosecurity investment. And what we see on the far left, these risk-tolerant behaviors implemented very little biosecurity. So red means no biosecurity implemented. And then each month, they can go from low to medium to high with a lag of 1 month to corresponding to a building phase in the real world. On the opposite spectrum, this risk-averse group tended to implement quite a bit of biosecurity very quickly. And then we can see here to demonstrate this opportunists actually look like they're risk-seeking when there's a low contagion rate, when they don't think there's much risk involved, but change dramatically to these risk-averse category as soon as they feel threatened. So why does that matter? We recruited 1,000 people with no industry experience, but we were able to do this quite rapidly with the online survey marketplace. In a couple of days, we recruited 1,000 people to play our experiment. But in order to verify some of these results, we actually rented a booth at the 2018 World Pork Expo and recruited 50 industry professionals to play our digital field experiment, which is tricky. But what we found was that from the simplified version of our game, when we compare all these risk aversion scores, the number of times people adopt biosecurity given each of these treatment scenarios, that the decision space actually looked quite similar across these two cohorts. That is, although we can't account for all the industry specialization and how they might attempt to tackle one of these digital field simulations, the underlying spectrum of behaviors seems to correlate quite well from this lower sample size. So what we're finding is we can use these digital decision support systems to identify some underlying behavioral categories. We're finding quite a bit of variability in behaviors and identified these three big groups, risk-averse, risk-tolerant, and opportunists. And now we can think about tailoring these targeted interventions to people who are maybe more responsive to risk information or maybe need some more nudging to move in the more healthier biosecurity investment. I'm going to pass this over to Ollin.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about how the players are learning from their own experience. Yeah. So what we've done here is to take the plays that they did in each round, and each time they have the ability to invest in several, like we experiment with several months, so they can choose to invest in an increasing way from July to December, or choose not to adopt, like to invest on biosecurity. So we use that to map this information into a vector space, and then to find groups of how they did invest or not invest, and find these type of communities for what they're doing in the time. So we have two granularities of time, each round and each month that they can decide to invest or not. So here in the So on the x-axis, we have the rounds that they can play, and on the y-axis is the month that they choose to invest or not to invest biosecurity in each of these rounds. And we can see that these four clusters, they have very different behaviors, and I'm going to explain what does that mean. Well, the first cluster here represents the person, the people that are always investing in biosecurity, so they don't change their behavior. They are always risk averse. They are trying to maximize their not getting infected rate. But there are others that are more interesting, like this one that starts by investing in biosecurity in the first rounds, but then start like increasingly not adopting, not investing in biosecurity. And so what we do, we need to understand what's driving these people to change their behavior. And here there's also a very interesting cluster, which are the ones that are not adopting as much, but then start investing in their the first months. And these are also like not that interesting because they are not adopting at all, like, or they are part of the group that Eric was saying, like they are opportunities. So if they see that they're not getting infected, but at the very end of the play they see that they have a chance to get infected, so they choose to invest like in the very last minute. Like, I don't want to lose my money that I've earned so far, so I choose to invest like right in the end, at the end. And well, I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. Yeah.
Is that 1 minute for questions as well? No, just told it. Okay, so just to bring this back, so we're using a lot of this data to support some of these digital decision support systems that Gabriela and Eric will have a chance to talk about a little later. So the data in itself is actually very interesting, but we'll also use those data to help parameterize a systems-wide look at this industry. So we're getting the information about the value of information and behavioral clustering, and how these strategies actually develop. And we can use all that information both from a basic science point of view as well as learning how we can actually effectively message. Again, I wanted to key in on this individual differences. It's really interesting to see that, and we have to be really aware that the same message can have the opposite response by people.
Thanks. Do we have time for one or two questions?
Just say your name and hold it close to your mouth.
Okay. Lucas Pantaleon, I'm a veterinarian consultant. So when you look at that pyramid that you guys showed, at the operational level and then the next level, I can't remember what it is, but it seems like the uncertainty plays a different role at each level of the pyramid. So how you explain that? Because if you give uncertainty to the managerial level, they will invest less in biosecurity, but at the operational level, they invest more. So how can you bring those two together to, make it more reasonable?
Well, what we found is that uncertainty is a very interesting signal because of these differences that we're seeing. That in some situations it actually seems to go as expected with the uncertainty aversion that most people, a lot of literature will suggest that people don't like uncertainty, so they're willing actually to pay in either opportunity costs or real costs to avoid that uncertainty. That's what theory would suggest, but we're actually seeing the opposite in some situations. So we need to be aware that simply going out with this preconceived notion that uncertainty will always do X is not the proper way of looking at this picture. There's a lot of nuance to it, and we have to examine those nuances to see how we can effectively use uncertainty.
Other questions? Great, thank you.